All right, here we see a quadratic equation because we have the x squared. And so we've got a few options to solve these types of problems, right? We've got an equal sign, there's some x's. So we could graph it, we could factor it, and we could use the quadratic formula. So first thing I want to do here is I want to see if I can maybe factor this out. So the x squared's on the left, so we're going to go ahead and subtract 5x squared from both sides, and we get x squared minus 2x minus 68 equals negative 5. And we're going to add 5 to both sides, and then we're going to check to see, can I factor this thing? Because if we can factor it, that's usually the quickest way if you can see it, right? If you can't see it, then we either go to the quadratic formula or we go to graphing. So as I look at this, I see 63. Well, I've got factors 7 and 9. I have one positive and one negative. This has to be a negative 9 and a positive 7. These two numbers add to give me my middle term, which is negative 2. And so I can see here that from these factors, I'm going to have parentheses. Now keep in mind, I didn't put this, but this whole thing equals 0. So the fact that this over here equals 0, right? Because once we take negative 5 plus 5, we have 0 on that side. So really what I have is I have x plus 7 times x minus 9 equals 0. Now, if you forget how to factor, if what I just did here doesn't make sense, go back and review the factoring video. Now, this is our zero product property. I have something times something equals 0. That means either of these can equal 0. So x plus 7 can equal 0, and x minus 9 can equal 0. So I set each of my factors, this x plus 7 equal to 0, and I set my x plus 9 equal to 0. And now I can solve each of these. So I subtract 7 from both sides. X equals negative 7. And then I'm going to add 9 to both sides. And x equals 9. So there are our two answers. Again, if we couldn't factor it, or maybe it is factorable, but you just don't see it, then your next step is probably the quadratic formula. You could graph, but usually our go-to for solving quadratic equations is either the quadratic formula or factoring. We try and factor first, though, because it's usually quicker. All right, we see a quadratic formula, and the reason we know that this thing's quadratic is because of the x squared here. So quadratic formula we can solve by graphing, solve by factoring, solve by the quadratic formula. The key here is that we need it set to 0. So we've got to get everything on one side. So I'm going to go ahead and add 7x to both sides. So this gives me x squared plus 2x equals 15. And it's a positive 15. So you can write the plus 15, right? Because this is what's left. Or you can just put equals 15. Now, we prefer to go ahead and just write equals 15. We understand that there's not a sign there, it's positive. So now I know that I need to subtract 15. I'm going to put a minus 15 here. Now keep in mind, this is my equal, whatever I do the right, I do the left. 2x and 15 are not like terms. So this is just x squared plus 2x minus 15. There's nothing on the right side, so it's set equal to 0. Now, from here we want to go ahead and factor this. I can see here that 3 times 5 is 15. So I'm going to be able to factor this. We're going to use our shortcut. It's still equal to 0. So it's going to be a plus 5 and a negative 3, because positive 5 times negative 3 is negative 15, right? So that's what we get here. And then positive 5 minus 3 is a positive 2. That's what we get for our middle term. So these check out okay. Keep in mind this is our zero product property. Something times something equals 0. So either this thing A or B, like A is my x plus 5, B is either one of these has to equal 0. So if the A and B confuse you, don't worry about them. Basically, something times something, right? This something times this something equals 0. One of those somethings has to equal 0. So x plus 5 equals 0, or x minus 3 equals 0. And so we go ahead and subtract 5 to solve this. We get x equals negative 5. Over here I go ahead and I add 3 to both sides to solve for x, and I get x equals 3. So we were able to solve this by factoring. You know, in this unit everything's going to be solvable by factoring because that's the title of it. However, you still need to go through the process of set everything to 0. Let's see if we can factor it. If we can't factor it, we move on to the quadratic formula. Alright, let's take a look at another problem here. We've got x squared plus 52 equals 15x minus 2. We want to set this thing equal to 0, so we're going to subtract the 15x from both sides. I'm going to go ahead and combine steps here too. I also know I want to get rid of this minus 2, so we're going to do a plus 2 on both sides. And if it's too much to do 2 steps at the same time, then just do 1 step at a time. Okay, so we have x squared. I've got my minus 15x. I have 52 plus 2, so that's plus 54. Like 1 and 54, 2 and 27, 3 and 18, 6 and 9. So yeah, so that's what our factors are. We got x, and I've got 6 here. I've got 9, and it's going to be a negative and a negative, because negative 6 times negative 9 is positive 54, and negative 6 plus negative 9 is negative 15, which gives us this middle term. Okay, so I've got my factors. Keep in mind this equals 0. Right, once we get rid of everything on the right, we're left with 0. And now we can go ahead and set each of these factors equal to 0. So I have x minus 6 equals 0. I have x minus 9 equals 0. I can add 6 to both sides here and get x equals 6. And over here I can add 9 to both sides, and I get x equals 9. And we were able to solve that by factoring, so we don't have to worry about the quadratic formula or anything. Alright, here we've got 3x squared plus 5 equals 5x plus 7. So again, we still see the quadratic equation because it has x squared. So we want to move everything over to one side. So we're going to subtract 5x from both sides. Now, notice I'm putting the 5x in between. I do see a 5 here, but there's no x. Those are not like terms. And I'm also going to subtract 7 from both sides. 2 steps in one. So we get 3x squared minus 5x, and then 5 minus 7 is minus 2. Now, we can go ahead and factor by the AC method. Remember, this equals 0. We could use a quadratic formula here. Quadratic formula takes some time. So by now you should be getting better at factor by grouping. So we're going to go ahead and solve this by factor by grouping. I'm going to show you a couple different ways to do this. All right. So 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. So I can see here this would be 3x squared minus 6x plus 1x minus 2. And we're going to factor by grouping. Again, we've done this in a previous video, so if you're struggling with that, go back and see that. Now, I can divide everything here by 3x. So I'm going to factor out of 3x. 3x squared divided by 3x is x. Negative 6x divided by 3x is minus 2. Over here, I can only factor out of 1, so it's just going to be plus 1. And then this just stays the same. It's going to be x minus 2. So you can see here I have x minus 2. And that I can factor out, and then I have 3x plus 1 left. Keep in mind this still equals 0. And so now what I want to do is same thing, right? This is a zero product property. Something times something equals 0. Either x minus 2 can equal 0, or I can have 3x plus 1 equals 0. So I'm going to add 2, I get x equals 2. And over here I'm going to subtract 1 from both sides. I get 3x equals negative 1. I divide both sides by 3, and I'm going to have x equals negative 1/3 for my other answer. Now, the one thing I wanted to point out here was that when we started out and we had this, right? So let me go ahead and write this over here. 3. So this is sort of something different. I'm just showing you another option you could have done. 3x squared minus 5x minus 2. If I want to factor that, look, at the front of this, I know it's going to be a 3x times an x. That's my only option. I can't, like 3 has no other factors other than 1 and 3. And at the end, so this gives me the front, this gives me my 3x squared. At the end I've got a minus 2. So it's either going to be a minus 2 plus 1, or it's going to be a 3x plus 1 times x minus 2. And as I look at this and I start to go ahead and FOIL this or distribute through, like I like to say, this is 3x squared plus 3x minus 2x. This gives me a positive 1x, so that won't work. If I look at this, I get 3x squared minus 6x plus 1x. That gives me my negative 5x here. So I can see here that these factors, so this is called the guess and check. Guess and check is when you've done enough factoring and you kind of know what you're doing. And so we could have just, see how these match up. Now the factors are written different, but that's okay. When we solved them, I would just get negative 1/3 first and then positive 2 second. But we still get it. We wouldn't have had to do this AC method here. So if you can figure out the guess and check, like when you get used to figuring out factoring, you don't necessarily need to do the AC method if it's something that you can see. Just go ahead and factor out and then solve. All right, we have another quadratic equation. So again, we're going to try and factor this if we're able to. And if we can't factor it, we're going to the quadratic formula. So we're going to subtract 10x from both sides. We're going to add 3 plus 3. On the left I get 4x squared, so I have 2x minus 10x, that's minus 8x. And I still have my plus 3 over here, equals 0. Now, this is a decent one to do guess and check. So if we were to do guess and check, you would be able to try 4x and x, or you could try 2x and 2x. So those of you who know what I'm talking about, go ahead and do a guess and check. That'll save you a little bit of time. If that guess and check doesn't make sense to you, no worries. We'll just go ahead and use the AC method, right? So we have 4 times 3 gives us 12. Factors of 12 that add up to give us, now keep in mind, it's either going to be a plus, plus, or negative, negative. So I have 1 and 12, 2 and 6, 3 and 4. I can see here that it's going to have to be a negative, negative. And the reason is because they're going to multiply to give me a positive 12, but they're going to add to give me a negative 8. And the only way to get a negative 8 is with 2 negative numbers. Can't get it with 2 positive numbers. Okay, so this negative 8x becomes minus 2x minus 6x. And then I have my 4x squared out front, and I have my minus 3 at the end, still equal to 0. And now I can factor this by grouping. So we're going to group first 2 terms, group second 2 terms, put a plus symbol in between them. And what can we divide out of the first 2 terms? Is 2x. The second 2 terms here, I can divide out a 3, but keep in mind this first term is negative, so we're actually going to divide out a negative 3. So as we look at this, I'm going to factor out a 2x. When I take 4x squared divided by 2x, I'm going to get 2x. And when I take negative 2x divided by positive 2x, I get a minus 1. Right? Then I factor out a negative 3. And negative 6x divided by negative 3 is just 2x. And then positive 3 divided by negative 3 is minus 1. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and group this up here so we can see that's part of this. And then I can go ahead and factor out a 2x minus 1 from both sides. One is on this side, one is on this side, and then we're left with 2x minus 3. Keep in mind this still equals 0. All right, so let's go ahead and set each of these equal to 0 and solve. So I have 2x minus 1 equals 0, and we're going to add 1 to both sides. We get 2x equals 1 divided by 2. We get x equals 1/2. And then I take my 2x minus 3 equals 0, and we're going to solve for that. X equals 3/2 or 1.5. So you could either write it as 3/2, or you can write it as 1.5 or 1.5. All right, so that's how we would work that one out. All right, another quadratic equation here. Let's go ahead and subtract 8x and add 10. Subtract 8x and add 10. Now I've got some bigger numbers here, so we may have to factor something out of this. We'll see plus x minus 2. Nope, I don't have to. So keep in mind, when you have something like a quadratic equation, once we move everything over, you always check and say, can I divide out a 2? Can I divide out a 3 or an x? Is there anything I can divide out to make this smaller and work with it? Here there's not, so let's go ahead and multiply. 6 times negative 2 is negative 12. And so with negative 12, it's going to be a plus 4 and a minus 3. That's going to give us our middle term. So I'm going to write 6x squared minus 3x plus 4x minus 2 equals 0. We can go ahead and group these. I'm going to divide the first by 3x, next group by 2. So I factor out a 3x. So 6x squared divided by 3x is 2x. Negative 3x divided by 3 is a negative 1. Here for the second one, we factored out a 2. It's a positive 2. So you're either going to have a plus or minus here. It's a positive 2, so we're factoring out a plus 2. And 4x divided by 2 is 2x. And negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. Now, you may ask me, well, what happens if these two don't match up? And we talked about that in a previous video. That means it's not factorable, or it also means potentially that you did something wrong. You made a silly mistake. So that being said, if they don't match up, the first thing I would suggest is to go back, check your work, make sure you didn't make a silly mistake, because that's a possibility, because most of the time these are going to work out. Right, now we go ahead and apply our zero product property. So I have 2x minus 1 equals 0. I have 3x plus 2 equals 0. And so plus 1, 2x equals 1 divided by 2. We get x equals 1/2. Subtract 2 from both sides. Divide by 3, and we get x equals negative 2/3. So one thing to think about is, what does this answer mean? Well, in graphing, remember, this is where the parabola crosses the x-axis. It's going to cross at 1/2 and negative 2/3. And keep in mind, it is a positive 6x squared here, so it's going to open up. So we know it's going to look something a little bit like if this was 1 and this was negative 1. It's going to cross right here at negative 2/3 and right here at positive 1/2. This thing opens up. So the parabola is going to look something a little bit like that. All right.